Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf. This marks the concluding episode of the Four Noble Truths. Step into the illuminating world of these truths, thoughtfully curated by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Jeffrey Degraff. Delve into the profound insights of Buddhist teachings, now available in audiobook form on the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Immerse yourself in the essence of these timeless truths, unraveling the nature of suffering, its origins, cessation, and the path to liberation. As you embark on this transformative journey, you are encouraged to play a pivotal role in sharing the wisdom of the Buddha. Your engagement is crucial. Share, appreciate, and subscribe to the content, enabling these teachings to reach a wider audience. Let's collectively contribute to the dissemination of profound insights and cultivate a community dedicated to inner peace and understanding. Together, we illuminate the path to enlightenment for seekers worldwide. Now let's start with Chapter 11. Clinging and Craving on the Path. As you commit to the path and reflect on your actions, you begin to appreciate the Buddha's strategy for attacking the problem of suffering. Before you abandon the cause of suffering, he has you develop something better to hold on to in the interim, both to make you more inclined to let go of your cravings and to ensure, when you do let go, that you won't be set adrift. In fact, his step-by-step discourse marked the beginning stage in providing you with that something better. As you recall, he gave that talk to wean his listeners away from their infatuation with sensuality. To do that, he provided them with a way of viewing the world in which a certain course of action, the renunciation of sensuality, is an obvious and attractive should, because it leads to your long-term welfare and happiness, with you defined in terms of multiple lifetimes. In other words, as you recall the four types of clinging that constitute the first noble truth, you'll see that he's recommending a view clinging and doctrine of self-clinging that will help get you started on the habits and practices of the path. This means that, as you get started on the path, the Buddha proposes three new versions of clinging to replace the unskillful ways of clinging in which you've engaged in the past. As for sensuality clinging, that has no role on the path at all, but the path itself proposes an interim pleasure, the pleasure, rapture, and equanimity of right concentration, that will form an alternative object of desire to replace your desires for sensuality. This non-sensual pleasure will be your food along the way, so that you're not tempted to revert to sensuality as the path gets difficult. In effect, with the practice of right concentration, the Buddha's offering a skillful type of habit and practice clinging to replace sensuality clinging as your source of inner food. In fact, of all three forms of clinging to be used in the path, habit and practice clinging is the most pivotal. After all, the path to the end of clinging is a path of action. We've noted that it's the karma that puts an end to karma, which is why the Buddha's teachings go into great detail on the habits and practices of virtue, concentration, and discernment that should be developed to form the path. However, to believe that such a path could actually work, you need a view about the world in which actions can be freely chosen and have the power to transcend the round of death and rebirth. This is why right views about action, karma, and rebirth also form part of the path. At the same time, you need to have a sense that you, as an agent, are capable of following the path, and that you, as a consumer, will benefit from doing so. This is why, as part of his strategy for motivating you to engage in the path factor of right effort, the Buddha provided many teachings to encourage a healthy sense of self, saying that the self is its own mainstay, that it's responsible for its actions, that it's capable of mastering the path, and that it will benefit from doing so. But it's worth noting that even though the early teachings are very detailed in their instructions as to what should and shouldn't be done, the worldviews and self-views they provide to support these instructions are nothing more than sketches. Because they're not the focus, the Buddha addressed views of the world and the self only when absolutely necessary to support the basic premises of karma. The truths of action and rebirth, for instance, were hotly debated by his contemporaries, so he had to take a position on those issues to justify the path of practice he taught. The size and age of the cosmos were also hot topics, but because they had no bearing on the power of action, the Buddha consistently put those topics aside. Similarly with issues of the self. Other philosophical schools debated the question of how best to define the self, but as we've seen, the Buddha noted that to define yourself was to limit yourself, so he refused to answer questions about what the self was, or even whether it existed. As he said, questions of that sort weren't worthy of attention. All he was concerned about was your perception of self, responsible for your actions, competent to follow the path, and able to benefit from doing so, and the reality of control. You can manipulate the aggregates at least enough to construct a path that can take you to awakening. The raft may be made of twigs and branches, but if you tie them together well enough, they can do the job. In fact, the question of action was so central to the path that one of its crucial steps was to learn how to see that your sense of the world and yourself were nothing more than actions themselves. They come about from things you do, and the act of holding to them is a kind of karma that, like all actions, carries consequences. As you follow the Buddha's instructions to provide yourself with skillful clinging to fall back on, you develop the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path, and as you develop those factors, you come to appreciate how well they target the three kinds of craving that cause suffering: craving for sensuality, craving for becoming, and craving for non-becoming. In other words, you see for yourself how the fourth noble truth helps put an end to suffering by attacking it right at the cause. The factors most directly involved in this approach are the ones that comprise the discernment group, right view and right resolve, and the concentration group, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. The remaining factors, in the virtue group, play more of a supporting role, in that they develop the clear conscience and mental sensitivity that right mindfulness and right concentration need in order to be honest and strong. The factors of the concentration group, in turn, provide an important foundation for making the discernment group sharper and more effective. They do this in three ways. As you recall from Chapter 6, one of the main reasons why people crave sensuality is because they can imagine no other alternative to pain. As the Buddha said, even when you can see the drawbacks of sensuality, if you have no access to a higher form of pleasure, you'll stay stuck in sensual craving. So one of the prime functions of right concentration is to provide that skillful alternative. Second, the fact that right concentration is composed of the five aggregates means that, as you work to develop it, you get hands-on experience in what the aggregates actually are and how they function. Because you play with them to create a state of concentration, they're now your playmates. You're on familiar terms with them as activities in which you engage, and this takes them from the realms of abstraction into the realm of direct active experience. Finally, the fact that right mindfulness and right concentration increase the steadiness of the mind means that right view can see the subtle motions of the mind, along with their interactions, much more clearly in real time. This connects with another point we made in Chapter 6. To go beyond craving for becoming and craving for non-becoming, you have to see the events of the mind that ordinarily lead up to becoming and develop dispassion for them as events before they have a chance to develop into a sense of self or world. The fact that right view looks at experience in terms of skillful and unskillful actions, and right resolve aims at avoiding unskillful mental attitudes, means that these discernment factors are equipped with the right framework to make this analysis. When supported by the factors of the concentration group, they can apply this framework to actual events. The canon says that craving for sensuality is the first form of craving to be overcome, followed by craving for becoming and non-becoming. This gives the impression that you focus exclusively first on sensuality and then on the other two forms of craving, but in actual practice, you need to attack all three at once. That's because sensuality fantasies and plans for sensual pleasures entails a sense of the self who will find and enjoy the pleasures, along with the world in which those pleasures will be found. This means that the grosser forms of becoming that surround sensuality will be the first to go, followed by the subtler ones that surround the practice of the path itself. To detect the events leading up to craving, and through craving and clinging to becoming, and then to develop dispassion for them, the Buddha recommends a 5-step program. 1. See their origination, i.e., what other events cause them. 2. Observe their passing away as those causes pass away. These 2 steps allow you to discern the fabricated nature of these events as steps in a process. 3. Look for their allure, why the mind is attracted to them. 4. Look for the drawbacks of clinging to them. When you see that the drawbacks far outweigh the allure. 5. The crucial steps in this approach are 3 and 4. As we noted in Chapter 6, one of the difficult aspects of truly understanding craving is to see precisely where it's located. That's the duty here of step 3. If you don't detect the exact location of the allure, then no matter how much insight you have into the drawbacks, that insight won't lead to true dispassion because it won't be on target. As for step 4, the Buddha prescribes many perceptions to apply to these fabricated events, to help you see that they're not worth the effort of fabricating states of becoming around them. These perceptions fall into 3 main groups. Focusing on the inconstancy of fabrications, focusing on the stress of whatever is inconstant, and focusing on the fact that if something is inconstant and stressful, it's not self. These perceptions are aimed at helping you to see that any state of becoming that you construct out of such raw materials won't lie totally under your control, and so inevitably will lead to disappointment. The effort required to construct a sense of self around such things is simply not worth it. It would be like building a house out of flimsy materials in an area prone to earthquakes. It could fall down at any time. When this value judgment hits home, that's how right view develops the dispassion that can put an end to that particular instance of craving for sensuality. In the beginning stages of the practice, as you're developing discernment aimed at dispassion, there's a natural tendency to hold on to the insights that work. After all, this is how discernment develops. You use your powers of alertness to see what gives good results in getting past a particular craving, and you use your powers of mindfulness to remember that lesson for future use. Your command of the path encourages you to hold on to it with more and more confidence. However, over time, as you get more skilled in reflecting on what you're doing as you develop this discernment, you begin to see that you're simply replacing gross forms of craving with subtler ones. The craving that leads you to cling to the factors of the path. After all, given that the factors of the path can be objects of clinging, and clinging is based on craving, those factors arise in dependence on the same sorts of mental events that underlie the cravings you've been abandoning. If you really want to be free from the stress of fabrications, you'll have to start letting go of the craving to hold on to the path, without, of course, reverting to craving in its more blatantly unskillful forms. This sort of reflective insight, backed up by heightened powers of concentration and discernment, is what enables you to begin developing the dispassion that leads to the noble attainments. Your act of letting go becomes more all-encompassing. You begin to let go, not only of the cravings you've been observing, but also of the factors of the path that underlie the act of observing. In fact, this is the stage of the practice where the separate duties of the 4 Noble Truths begin to converge. Dispassion, which is the duty with regard to the second Noble Truth, now becomes the duty for all 4. Comprehending suffering leads to having dispassion for clinging. Developing the path, and especially the factor of right view, leads to having dispassion for the factors of the path. Even when realizing cessation, you have to have dispassion for it if you want your freedom to be all around. The main turning point is when you start developing dispassion for the path. The canon describes a variety of ways in which this can happen. This means that the exact insight that will lead to a breakthrough to the noble attainments will vary from person to person. In the most general terms, the canon says that you take the same 5-step program that you applied to acts of craving and clinging, and you apply it to the 5 faculties of conviction, persistence, mindfulness, concentration, and discernment. Because the faculty of conviction includes the virtue group of the Noble Eightfold Path, and the faculty of persistence is the same thing as right effort, this means that, in effect, you apply this framework to all the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. You see how the path originates from causes and how it passes away. You see its allure in freeing you from stress and suffering, and in providing you with the peace and pleasures of jhana, but you also see its drawbacks in that it's fabricated, and so has to be constantly maintained. In some cases, the canon says that you focus this analysis on the practice of concentration, seeing how it's composed of the 5 aggregates, and applying the same perceptions of inconstancy, stress, and not self to those aggregates until the mind inclines toward the deathless. In other cases, it says that you apply the insights of right view to right view itself. Just as right view has taught you to regard views as actions, and to see the stress that comes from clinging to those views, it now teaches you to look for the stress in clinging to right view. When you see this stress clearly as a drawback, that insight inclines the mind in the direction of the deathless. In either case, you realize that you can't stay where you are, nor can you go to any other mental location, for that would involve craving and stress as well. If, while the mind is faced with this dilemma, an opening occurs that is neither here nor there, that's the opening to the deathless. The canon illustrates this point with a paradox. A heavenly being once asked the Buddha how he crossed over the flood, and he replied that he neither pushed forward nor stayed in place. That was how he was freed from locations and everywhere released. Now, the canon warns that, on gaining an experience of the deathless, it is possible to feel passion and delight for it, and so to cling to it. When that happens, your awakening is only partial, as the mind still has a location. The perception of the deathless to which it clings. This is because your powers of reflection are still not strong enough. You didn't catch these new acts of craving and clinging in time. And while even a partial experience of the deathless is life-changing, it confirms your conviction in what the Buddha taught, that the ending of suffering is possible. It also teaches you that there's more work to be done. You'll have to pick up the path again in order to strengthen your powers of concentration and discernment, so that the next time the opening to the deathless occurs, you'll be better prepared. It's because the experience of the deathless is so overwhelming that the canon forewarns you. You need to apply the perception of not self not only to fabricated phenomena, but also to the deathless itself. And as we've noted, you'll then have to let go of that perception, too, so that your release will be complete. All of which goes to show the importance of the basic training in truthfulness that the Buddha recommended for his followers from the very beginning. As you learn to be more honest and observant toward your actions, to be accurate in the perceptions you apply to your experiences, and to be truthful in reporting your actions and in citing the source of your views, you begin to develop the reflective skills that will carry you all the way to the reality of suffering's end. Chapter 12. True Beyond True. The Buddha concluded his first talk by detailing the knowledge that led to his full awakening. This knowledge revolved around the 4 noble truths. In the case of each truth, he had direct knowledge of the truth itself, knowledge of the duty appropriate to the truth, and knowledge that he had completed the duty. 4 truths, 3 levels of knowledge for each truth, 12 permutations of knowledge in all. He set out all 12 permutations in what we would call a table, but what the legal and philosophical traditions of his time called a wheel. The heavenly beings overhearing the first talk called this table the Dharma wheel. This is why the wheel has been the symbol of the Buddha's teachings ever since. But the Buddha's knowledge on the night of his awakening didn't stop with this 12-fold knowledge. It was followed by release, the total freedom of the deathless, outside of the confines of space and time, and then the knowledge that this release was unprovoked. The Buddha's use of the word unprovoked here relates to another tradition from his time. The theory of dhatu, or elemental properties. Physical and mental events were seen as resulting from basic elemental properties that existed in a latent potential form, either in physical nature or in the mind. When a property was provoked, it would react and display itself, in line with the force of the provocation, until that force ran out. Individual fires, for instance, were understood as the provocation of the fire property, floods, the provocation of the water property, sensual desires, the provocation of the property of sensuality. One of the implications of this theory was that anything provoked was inherently unstable. Events depending on provocations that would come and go would themselves have to come and go. Nothing provoked could last forever. Even unbinding was described as a property, but as one with a difference. It's a property that's never provoked. It's simply attained. Because true release is not caused by the provocation of anything, the implication is that it's not subject to change. Following on this knowledge, the Buddha said, he knew two things more. This was his last birth, and there was now, for him, no further becoming. That, of course, was because the craving leading to further becoming was now fully abandoned. The canon calls this attainment the full attainment of the truth. And as we noted in Chapter 7, true is one of the epithets of unbinding. It's also called the highest noble truth. However, the canon contains a paradox around the relationship between fully awakened people on the one hand, and truth on the other. Even though they have attained the truth, those who are awakened are said to be beyond being swayed by claims of true and false, having sloughed off all views. We can begin to resolve this paradox when we remember that truth in the canon has two meanings: the truth of realities in and of themselves, and the social truth of words about those realities. Awakened people have attained the reality of unbinding once and for all. That's the sense in which they've attained the truth. Because the reality of their release is total, they have no more need to cling to the truths of words or claims, which, as we've noted many times, are true instrumentally. Like hammers and saws that have served their purpose, these truths can be put aside. Also, the canon notes that awakened people have directly seen the limits of description, along with what lies beyond description. So there's no reason for them to cling to any of the social truths of words or descriptions at all. What does this mean in practice? Two things. 1. Issues framed in the terms of becoming hold no interest for awakened people, because they've developed dispassion for the events that would lead to becoming, and as a result they've gone beyond becoming. So they see no reason to take sides on those issues. 2. As for issues of right view, awakened people continue to appreciate right views about skillful and unskillful actions in general, and the Four Noble Truths in particular, but with no sense of being attached to those views. In the first case, the canon states as an example that the following questions hold no interest even for a person who has had a first glimpse of the deathless. Was I in the past? Was I not in the past? What was I in the past? How was I in the past? Having been what was I in the past? Shall I be in the future? Shall I not be in the future? What shall I be in the future? How shall I be in the future? Having been what shall I be in the future? Am I? Am I not? What am I? How am I? Where has this being come from? Where is it bound? In short, questions of what the self is and whether it existed in the past, will exist in the future, or exists right now, no longer hold any interest for those who are awakened. They detect how these questions come from unskillful mind states, immersed in the terms of becoming, so they see no reason to ask them or to be attached to any answers offered in response. As for the relationship of fully awakened people to right view, two similes from the canon give an idea of what that might be like. The first simile is the image of a skinned cow, not a pretty image, but one that makes an important point in a graphic way. A butcher, having killed a cow, carves it up with a sharp carving knife, so that without damaging the substance of the inner flesh, without damaging the substance of the outer hide, he would cut, sever, and detach only the skin muscles, connective tissues, and attachments in between. Then he covers the cow again with the skin. Even though the skin is touching the inner flesh again, it's not connected in the way it was before. In this simile, the inner flesh stands for the six senses, the outer hide stands for the objects of the senses, and the attachments in between stand for passion and delight. In the same way, awakened people, after going beyond the six senses in their experience of release, then return to experience the six senses again, but they're no longer joined to the senses as they were before. Because their minds have no passion or delight for the senses, they feel no need to cling, in other words, no need to take the senses as nutriment. So they relate to the senses in the same way that a person totally free of hunger would relate to food. The canon states repeatedly that fully awakened people can fully function in the world, but, as we've noted, they do so with a sense of being disjoined from it. They're disjoined from feelings of pleasure, pain, and neither pleasure nor pain, and even from the objects of right mindfulness and right concentration, as they continue using their meditative powers to help others. This sense of being disjoined is not the painful dissociation of alienation. It's simply the result of the fact that their happiness is now so complete that they have no hunger for anything, views of true and false included. The fact that they no longer delight in the senses doesn't mean that their minds are dulled. They simply see no need to amplify the pleasures of the senses by exclaiming about them to themselves. They've found, in the deathless, a pleasure that needs no amplification at all. As they relate to the world, they can still make use of ideas of true and false, right and wrong, in the desire that their actions based on those views will lead to good results for beings of the world. But because they no longer cling to their desires, none of these activities make inroads on the mind. The fact that they still act for the good of the world relates to the second simile, the image of the raft we've cited several times in the course of this book. You find yourself on the unsafe shore of a river, so you construct a raft of twigs and branches. Then, holding tight to the raft and making an effort with your hands and feet, you swim to the safety of the far shore. Once you've arrived, though, you don't continue to carry the raft on your head. Instead, you leave it there on the shore and continue on your way. Before you leave it, though, you reflect on it with appreciation. How useful this raft has been to me. For it was in dependence on this raft that, making an effort with my hands and feet, I've crossed over to safety on the far shore. In other words, even in letting go of the truths of right view, you don't treat them with indifference. You realize that, to gain freedom from clinging, you needed to have right view about how clinging constituted suffering, how clinging came about, and how it could be put to an end. You can't simply let go of views of true and false without this understanding. If you had tried letting go of views by claiming to be agnostic, that would simply have been another view to cling to. If you had tried claiming to have no fixed views, you would have become a serial clinger, letting go of one view to hold on to another. So you appreciate the usefulness of the truths of right view. Without its special perspective, focusing on the benefits and drawbacks of the act of forming and holding to views, you wouldn't have gained total freedom from views. For this reason, when you have a chance to teach others, you recommend that they adopt right view as well. After all, this is what the Buddha did. After gaining awakening to the Dharma, he honored and revered the Dharma for the rest of his life. Having developed full knowledge of the truths of the Dharma wheel, he then set that wheel rolling in his first talk, making these truths available to others throughout the world, so that they, too, could use them to arrive at the reality of total release. Because of his compassionate efforts, people can still take the question that animated their search for an end to pain, and put it truly to rest. Appendix. To the far shore. As we've noted frequently throughout this book, the Four Noble Truths were the Buddha's preeminent teaching. If you want to understand how his teachings fit together, you have to take the Four Noble Truths as the context, and then see how other teachings fit into that context. This is what appropriate attention, the most useful internal quality leading to awakening, means. Take, for example, the three perceptions of inconstancy, stress, and not self. The Buddha taught that these perceptions should be applied to suffering and its cause, as a way of fostering dispassion for the objects of clinging and craving, and for the acts of clinging and craving themselves. In this way, these perceptions are aids in carrying out the duties appropriate to the Four Noble Truths. To comprehend suffering, to abandon its cause, to realize its cessation by developing the path. That's how, in the Buddha's original teachings, the Four Noble Truths and their duties supply the context for the three perceptions and determine their role in the practice. However, in the centuries following the Buddha's total nibbana, Buddhist scholars began to reinterpret the three perceptions, renaming them the three characteristics. Once these perceptions were renamed, they morphed in two other ways as well. First, they turned into a metaphysical teaching, as the characteristics of what things are. All are devoid of essence because they're impermanent, and, because nothing has any essence, then assuming that something has to be permanent to qualify as a self, there is no self. Second, because these three characteristics were now metaphysical truths, they became the context within which the Four Noble Truths functioned and were true. This switch in roles has led to many changes in the way the Buddha's teachings have been taught and practiced in the centuries ever since. All too often, though, these changes have not been recognized as changes and have been retroactively attributed to the Buddha himself. Because many of these changes are still influential, it's good to know what they are, so that whenever you encounter them, you can recognize them as distortions of what the Buddha actually taught. The first change to note is that once the Four Noble Truths were placed within the context of the three characteristics, they morphed as well. Whereas the Buddha had identified suffering with all types of clinging, even the act of clinging to the phenomenon of the deathless, the unchanging dimension touched at the first taste of awakening. The relationship between clinging and suffering was now explained by the metaphysical fact that all possible objects of clinging were impermanent. To cling to them as if they were permanent would therefore bring sorrow and disappointment. As for the ignorance that underlies craving, whereas the Buddha had defined it as ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, it was now defined as ignorance of the three characteristics. From this new definition, it was argued that people cling and crave because they don't realize that nothing has any essence and that there is no self. If they were to realize the truth of these teachings through direct experience, this became the purpose of mindfulness practice. They wouldn't cling anymore, and so they wouldn't suffer. This switch in context, giving priority to the three characteristics over the Four Noble Truths, has come to dominate modern Buddhism. The common pattern is that when modern authors explain right view, which the Buddha equated with seeing things in terms of the Four Noble Truths, the discussion quickly switches from the Four Noble Truths to the three characteristics to explain why clinging leads to suffering. Clinging is no longer directly equated with suffering. Instead, it causes suffering because it assumes permanence and essence in impermanent things. Even those teachers who deny the truth of the Four Noble Truths on the grounds that the principle of impermanence means that no statement can be true everywhere for everyone, still accept the principle of impermanence as a metaphysical truth, accurately describing the way things everywhere are. As these explanations have percolated through modern culture, both among people who identify themselves as Buddhist and among those who don't, they've given rise to four widespread misunderstandings of the Buddha's teachings on clinging and how it's best avoided so as to stop suffering. 1. Because there is no self, there is no agent. People are essentially on the receiving end of experience, and they suffer because they cling to the idea that they can resist or control change. 2. To cling means to hold on to something with the misunderstanding that it's permanent. For this reason, as long as you understand that you yourself and the things around you are impermanent, you can embrace things briefly as they arise in the present moment, and it doesn't count as clinging. If you embrace experiences in full realization that you'll have to let them go so as to embrace whatever comes next, you won't suffer. As long as you're fully in the moment with no expectations about the future, you're fine. 3. Clinging comes from the mistaken view that there can be such a thing as long-term happiness. But because all things are fleeting, there is no such thing. Pleasures, like pains, simply come and go. When you can resign yourself to this fact, you can open to the spacious wisdom of non-clinging, equanimous and accepting, as you place no vain expectations on the fleeting show of life. These three misunderstandings are often illustrated with the image of a perfectly fluid dancer, happily responsive to changes in the music decided by the musicians, switching partners with ease. Another popular image is that you're sitting on the ocean shore, watching the waves come in. If you're stupid enough to want to cling to good waves to make them permanent and to push bad waves away, you'll suffer. But if you accept the fact that waves are just waves, fleeting and incessant, and that there's no way you can either stop them or keep them, you can be at peace as you simply watch, with full acceptance, as they keep doing their thing. 4. The fourth widespread misunderstanding about the Buddhist stance on clinging is closely related to the other three. Clinging means holding on to fixed views. If you have set ideas about what's right or wrong, or about how things should be, even about how the Buddha's teachings should be interpreted, you'll suffer. But if you can let go of your fixed views and simply accept the fact that right and wrong keep changing along with everything else, you'll be fine. It's been argued that these four understandings of the Buddha's teachings on clinging don't promote an attitude of unhealthy passivity, on the grounds that if you're fully attuned to the present moment without clinging, you can be more agile and creative in responding to change. But still, there's something inherently defeatist in the picture they offer of life and of the possibilities of happiness that we as human beings can find. They allow for no long-term happiness, much less an unchanging happiness, no dimension where we can be free from the unpredictability of waves or sudden changes in the music. It's only within this narrow range of possibilities that our non-clinging creativity can eke out a little peace. And when we compare these misunderstandings with the Buddha's actual teachings on clinging and the end of clinging, returning the three characteristics to their original role as three perceptions, and using those perceptions in the context of the Four Noble Truths, we can see not only how far the popular misunderstandings of his teachings deviate from what he actually taught, but also what an impoverished view of the potentials for happiness those popular misunderstandings provide. To begin the comparison, as we noted in Chapter 5, the Pali word for clinging, upadana, also means sustenance and the act of taking sustenance. In other words, food and the act of eating. The connection between feeding and suffering was one of the Buddha's most radical and valuable insights, because it's so counterintuitive and at the same time so useful. Ordinarily, we find so much pleasure in the act of feeding, emotionally as well as physically, that we define ourselves by the way we feed off the world and the people around us. It took someone of the Buddha's genius to see the suffering inherent in feeding, and that all suffering is a type of eating. The fact that we feed off things that change simply adds an extra layer of stress on top of the stress intrinsic in the felt need always to feed. And just as we feed off physical food without assuming that it's going to be permanent, clinging to things doesn't necessarily mean that we assume them to be permanent. We cling whenever we sense that the effort of clinging is repaid by some sort of satisfaction, permanent or not. We cling because there's some pleasure in the things to which we cling. When we can't find what we'd like to cling to, our hunger forces us to take what we can get. For this reason, the act of embracing things in the present moment still counts as clinging. Even if we're adept at moving from one changing thing to another, or one changing sense of ourselves to another, it simply means that we're serial clingers, taking little bites out of every passing thing. We still suffer in the incessant drive to keep finding the next bite to eat. This is why being constantly mindful of the truth of impermanence isn't enough to solve the problem of suffering. To really solve it, we need to change our feeding habits radically, so that we can strengthen the mind to the point where it no longer needs to feed. This requires the two-pronged strategy mentioned in Chapter 6. A. Seeing the drawbacks of our ordinary ways of feeding, and B. Providing the mind with better food in the meantime, until it has outgrown the need to feed on anything at all. The first prong of the strategy is where the three perceptions come in as part of the Buddha's 5-step program for inducing dispassion for the first and second noble truths, which we discussed in Chapter 11. First, you apply these three perceptions to things to which you might cling or crave, to see that the benefits of holding on to those things are far outweighed by the drawbacks. You focus on the extent to which the happiness they provide is inconstant, and that because it's inconstant, the effort to rest in it involves stress. When you see that the happiness isn't worth the effort of the clinging, you realize that it's not worthy to claim as yours. It's not self. In other words, not worth claiming as self. In this way, the perception of not self isn't a metaphysical assertion, saying that there is no permanent self. It's a value judgment, saying that the effort to define yourself either as permanent or not around the act of feeding on those things simply isn't worth it. This analysis works, however, only if you have something better to feed on in the interim. Otherwise, you'll just go back to your old feeding habits. Nobody ever stopped eating simply through the realization that foods and stomachs are impermanent. This is where the second prong of the Buddha's strategy comes in. You develop the path as your interim nourishment, focusing in particular on the pleasure and rapture of right concentration as your alternative source of food. When the path is fully developed, it opens to another dimension entirely. the deathless, a happiness beyond the reach of time, space, and all phenomena of the six senses. But because the mind is such a habitual feeder, on its first encounter with the deathless it tries to feed on it, which turns the experience into a phenomenon, an object of the mind. Of course, that act of feeding stands in the way of full awakening. As we noted in Chapter 11, this is where the perception of not-self gets put to use once more, to counteract this last form of clinging to the deathless. Even though the deathless in itself is neither stressful nor inconstant, any act of clinging to it has to involve stress. So the perception of not-self has to be applied here as well, to peel away this last obstacle to full awakening beyond all phenomena. When this perception has done its work, it, too, gets put aside just as everything else is let go and the mind, free from hunger, gains full release. The canon gives an image for this release that we've cited frequently throughout this book. A person standing on firm ground after taking the raft of the Noble Eightfold Path over a river in flood. Safe from the waves and currents of the river, the person is totally free, even freer than the image can convey. There's nothing intrinsically hunger-free about standing on a riverbank after crossing a river in flood, it's more a symbol of relief. But everyone who has experienced what the image is pointing to guarantees that, to the extent that you can call it a place, it's a place of no hunger, and so no need for desire. If we compare this image with that of the person on the shore of the ocean watching the waves, we can get a sense of how limited the happiness that's offered, by understanding the Four Noble Truths, in the context of the three characteristics is, as opposed to the happiness offered by understanding the three perceptions in the context of the Four Noble Truths. To begin with, the Buddha's image of crossing the river doesn't put quotation marks around concepts of good and bad waves in the water. The flood is genuinely bad, and the ultimate goodness in life is when you can totally get beyond it. Second, unlike the image of sitting on the shore, watching an ocean beyond your control, the Buddha's image conveys the point that there's something you can do to get to safety. You have within you the power to follow the duties of the Four Noble Truths and, in particular, to develop the path that will take you to the other side. As we noted in Chapter 4, discernment begins with the question, what, when I do it, will lead to long-term welfare and happiness? The discernment here lies in seeing that there is such a thing as long-term happiness, that it's preferable to short-term, and that it depends, not on conditions beyond your control, but on actions you can train yourself to do. This discernment is a far cry from the wisdom that ends in resigned equanimity and reduced expectations. It honors your desire for long-term happiness and shows how it can actually be found. Third, to sit watching the ocean waves come ashore is peaceful and desirable, only as long as you're wealthy enough to be at a resort, with someone to bring you food, drink, and shelter on a regular basis. Otherwise, you need to keep searching for these things on your own. And even at the resort, you're not safe from being swept away by tsunamis or storms. The image of crossing the river to safety on the far shore also offers an enlightening perspective on the view that all fixed views should be abandoned. In the canon's own interpretation of the image, the river stands for the fourfold flood of sensuality, becoming, views, and ignorance, while the raft of the Noble Eightfold Path includes right view. Although it's true that the raft is abandoned on reaching the far shore, you still have to hold on to it while you're crossing the river. Otherwise, you'll be swept downstream. What's rarely noticed is the paradox contained in the image. Right view, seeing things in terms of the Four Noble Truths, is part of the raft needed to cross over the flood of views. As the Buddha saw, it's the only view that can perform this function, taking you safely all the way across the river and delivering you to safety. It can take you across because it's always true and always relevant. Cultural changes may affect what we choose to feed on, but the fact of feeding is a constant, as is the connection between suffering and the need to feed. In that sense, right view counts as fixed. It can never be replaced by a more effective understanding of suffering. At the same time, it's always relevant, in that the framework of the Four Noble Truths can be brought to bear on every choice you make at every stage of the practice. Here it differs from the three perceptions, for while the Buddha noted that they're always true, they're not always relevant. If, for instance, you perceive the results of all actions, skillful or not, as impermanent, stressful, and not self, it can dissuade you from making the effort to be skillful in what you do, say, or think. In addition to being always true and relevant, right view is responsible. It gives reliable guidance on what should and shouldn't be taken as food for the mind. As the Buddha said, any teaching that can't give trustworthy guidelines for determining what actions are skillful and unskillful abdicates a teacher's primary responsibility to his or her students. After taking you responsibly all the way across the river, right view can deliver you to the far shore, because it contains the seeds for its own transcendence, which as you develop them deliver you to a transcendent dimension. As we noted in Chapter 11, right view does this by focusing on the processes by which the mind creates stress for itself, at the same time encouraging you to abandon those processes when you sense that they're causing stress. In the beginning, this involves clinging to right view as a tool to pry loose your attachments to gross causes of stress. Over time, as your taste for mental food becomes more refined through your diet of right concentration, you become sensitive to causes of stress that are more and more subtle. These you abandon as you come to detect them, until eventually there's nothing else to abandon aside from the path. That's when right view encourages you to turn the analysis on the act of holding on to and feeding on right view itself. When you can abandon that, there's nothing left for the mind to cling to, so it's freed. The view that all fixed views should be abandoned, however, doesn't contain this dynamic. It provides no grounds for deciding what should and shouldn't be done. In itself, it can act as an object of craving and clinging, becoming as fixed as any other view. If you decide to drop it, for whatever reason, it delivers you nowhere. It offers no guidance on how to choose anything better, and as a result, you end up clinging to whatever passing view seems attractive. You're still stuck in the river, grasping at pieces of flotsam and jetsam as the flood carries you away. This is why it's always important to remember that, in the practice to gain freedom from suffering, the Four Noble Truths must always come first. They give guidance to the rest of the path, determining the role and function of all the Buddha's other teachings, including the three perceptions, so that, instead of lulling you into being satisfied with an exposed spot on the beach, they can take you all the way to the safety of full release, beyond the reach of any possible wave. As we conclude the final episode of Four Noble Truths, I extend heartfelt gratitude for your tuning in. Your support propels the growth of our channel and serves as a constant inspiration for us to intensify our efforts in disseminating Buddha's wisdom. Please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to propel our mission forward. Your active involvement fuels our commitment to making Buddha's profound teachings accessible to a wider audience. If you've discovered value in our content, a simple click on the like button, sharing our content, and subscribing to stay connected would mean a lot. Together, let's foster a community that embraces enlightenment and wisdom. Your role in this journey is indispensable, and we appreciate you being a crucial part of it. Thank you.